I don't want to live anymore. There's no point to living. No one deserves to live like this. I can't bear the pain in my heart. I will leave behind some trace for the world. We give up our lives for justice, truth, and freedom. These were the last words spoken by several Tibetan monks before they committed the act of self-immolation. Self-immolation is regarded as a suicidal sacrifice, usually done by fire, in the form of protest against political and religious persecution. These ethnic Tibetans have trouble following their beliefs, practice, and culture underneath the Chinese regime. In our case study, we hope to explore the idea of self-immolation through the analysis of their belief, culture, and the Dalai Lama. I'm Jacob Meeks.
I'm Sophie Ramsey.
I'm Kirsten Vaughn.
I'm Austin Van Sickle.
And this is our project.
By any means necessary.
Tibet has struggled with China for a long time, and their people have never really known a free Tibet. In fact, in 1910, Red China shot an unarmed crowd in Lhasa. The fighting took a hiatus briefly after for 3 years, but then in 1933 the truce was broken and the fighting ensued again. In 1950, the Chinese occupation began. Shortly after the protests began. In 1959, 87,000 Tibetan protesters were killed, and the Dalai Lama had to flee to India. In 1963, the Dalai Lama approved a democratic constitution for the Tibetan exile community, and a year later, the Panchen Lama was arrested after calling for Tibetan independence. All along, while this was happening, the Chinese government had been destroying Buddhist temples in the Tibetan Autonomous Region. In 1978, there were 8 temples left from 2,700 that were there before the occupation began. The struggle continued when the Dalai Lama named 11-year-old Gedhun Choki the new Panchen Lama, but the Chinese government denounced his choice. The first reported case of this self-immolation was Tabe from the Kirti monastery. He was chanting and carrying a Tibet national flag into the village, and he stood in the middle of the village and set himself on fire. And witnesses say that Chinese police surrounded him immediately and 3 shots were heard. Since this March 2009 case, there's been 140 monks who have done this act. A 2012 New York Times article about one of these self-immolation protests said, "The death suggests that self-immolation is gaining favor as a form of political protest for Tibetan clergy. And they underscore the challenges that Chinese authorities face in controlling more than 5 million ethnic Tibetans." The Dalai Lama today still won't denounce what the protests are doing as against their religion, because it's kind of iffy if it is or not.
Alright, so to understand Tibet, it's obviously important to understand Buddhism. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Buddhism and then in specific how Tibetans practice it. So Buddhism is an interesting religion, as many of us know, because it doesn't fall into the category of religion as typical ones do. A lot of people actually call it a practice instead. This is because the line between the spiritual side and the social side is fairly blurred, and especially so in Tibet. And in understanding Tibetan self-immolation, it's incredibly important to understand this and how that is manifested. So first, there are 3 main paths to Buddhism: the Hinayana or the Theravada, the Mahayana, and the Vajrayana path. So the Hinayana is the first path. The Hinayana path emphasizes the acceptance of general Buddhist thought and is mainly the original path. It emphasizes the teaching that one suffers by desire and will find enlightenment by detachment, and allows for an individual path to enlightenment. The second path is the Mahayana path. The Mahayana path emphasizes the concept of the Bodhisattva, or the Buddha, which is the person who has found enlightenment and can achieve nirvana, but decides to stay on earth to help others find enlightenment as well. And then the last path is the Vajrayana path. The Vajrayana path is an offshoot of Mahayana, and it emphasizes esoteric means by which to expedite the process to becoming a bodhisattva. So instead of the Mahayana slow, ritualistic path in which it could take several lifetimes to become a bodhisattva, the Vajrayana path is riskier and says that you can become one in one lifetime. And all this is according to Aaron Tam. So the core principles of Buddhism. The core principles are karma, rebirth, and enlightenment, according to Kapstein and Goldstein. Thus, one receives good karma for their interactions with the world and others, and then are reincarnated according to that karma, and in each reincarnation should be seeking enlightenment. And then, according to Miller and Lin, compassion is the most important goal for all sentient beings. Thus, Kapstein and Goldstein emphasize good relationships with others as being of the utmost importance to a Buddhist. Tibetans are suffering under Chinese rule. So what does Buddhism say about how to end suffering? Shabai Segura explains to us that you have to acknowledge the nature of reality as sunyata, or emptiness. The main teaching here is the Four Noble Truths. 1, you have to acknowledge suffering exists. 2, that it comes from desire. 3, that you must remove yourself from selfish desires. And 4, do so by following the Eightfold Path, which emphasizes 8 right means by which to live life. Right view, aspiration, speech, action, livelihood, effort, mindfulness, and concentration. A second core concept is the 4 Brahma Viharas that one must follow through social action. Metta, loving kindness, karuna, compassion, mudita, sympathetic joy, and upekkha, equanimity. So a common theme that you can tell is compassion and detaching from desire. A protest is in some ways a selfish act as it reflects a desire for change in some way. Thus, self-immolation can seem contrary to normal Buddhist practice. So what type of Buddhism do the Tibetans practice? Tibetan Buddhism follows all of these main tenets except for it emphasizes the Vajrayana path above all. The Vajrayana path, as we mentioned, is the path by which trial and error is encouraged and you can live actively in the samsara, or mundane world. So you live through the mundane world instead of detaching from it, and you learn from it, which makes it riskier but quicker. So Miller and Lin offer a good sum of the Vajrayana path in one quote. Let us see the opponent as the teacher. Thus, Tibetan Buddhism encourages debate and skepticism, and the guru-disciple relationship is emphasized above all. Kapstein and Goldstein point out the mass monasticism in Tibet, where young Tibetans are taken to monastery from a very young age and are taken to become monks, and monks have a disproportionate influence in the government. Further, there's the office of the Dalai Lama, which also has an extreme amount of influence in Tibet. Thus, the line between church and state is blurred, and you can have more influence in interpretation. Further, Tibetan Buddhism has been called Buddhism in its least recognizable form by Lieberman. Its esoteric practice and guru-disciple relationship allows for a lot more interpretation, as I mentioned, and lets us stray from original principles. This could explain why Tibet practices self-immolation and doesn't find it against the normal Buddhist principles because it's the furthest from the original Buddhist conception. So is self-immolation allowed in Buddhism? Well, it's obviously controversial. I have a little interesting anecdote for you guys about this. A Chinese monk, Dao Du, came to his emperor Lang Yu in 526. He said, "The body is a poisonous plant. It would be really right to burn it and extinguish its life." He draws inspiration from the Buddhist text, the Lotus Sutra, in which a Buddhist sets himself on fire and experiences a good cosmic or karmic response because of it. The emperor responded, "By donating your body to the birds and the beast, one makes good karma. Because of the 80,000 worms, it is not appropriate to burn yourself. It is not something to be encouraged." He's saying by depriving the 80,000 worms of his body, he's in fact creating bad karma because he deprives the good karma from other sentient beings. The Chinese Buddhist concept of yang yin relates to the justification of self-immolation. The yang is the event and the yin is the cosmic response. And you can remember this as I finish the story. After talking with the emperor, Dao Du invited fellow monks to his mountain retreat. 300 monks came and attended, and shortly after he stopped eating. His fellows claimed to see rays of light emanating from his home. He said that 500 or 600 birds came to his home, and supernatural events continued. Finally, they found Dao Du at the top of the mountain burning alive. Shortly after, a tree which had been dead for 10 years blossomed and came to life, and a chime could be heard at the top of the mountain. Daodu's yang was self-immolation, and the yin was the cosmic response, which benefited and said that it was positive. As karma is a key concept of Buddhism, this offers a complex incentive for self-immolation and could explain why it's okay in Tibet, or maybe come across as okay to other Buddhists in theology. But in terms of why self-immolation is justified now, it could possibly be corruption of the idea by Dalai Lama, by the monks, and by the government in Tibet. It could be Daodu's yang and yin cosmic response. But it could also just be a desperate Tibetan trying to be heard.
In Tibetan belief, the Dalai Lama is seen as a reincarnated manifestation of the Buddha's teaching of compassion. However, this posed a challenge to the current Dalai Lama. In 1951, China invaded Tibet, and in 1959, China rushed a failed revolt from Tibetans, where thousands of Tibetans died. At 16 years of age, the current Dalai Lama lost his land, and at 24, he lost his country. Under the Chinese regime, Tibetans must denounce the Dalai Lama's authority at risk of death. Most can even be seen worshipping Tibetan Buddhism. Tibetans have struggled to keep and perpetuate their culture of nonviolence and compassion, as well as forgiveness. The Dalai Lama believes that the conflict between China and Tibet is that of gun and truth, violence and words. The Dalai Lama argues that China uses the gun accordingly to find sudden satisfaction, but however, this sudden satisfaction doesn't give you any long-term gratification. If you use truth, it helps you in the long run, not only in this life, but in the next one. To use the gun in accordance to China would cause karmic rebirth, which means that to kill someone else will ultimately affect yourself. In your next life, you will appear in a more sorrowful form. The Dalai Lama argues that Tibetans must fight for their rights and impose injustice. To not do so is a violence in and of itself. Although they live in a culture of non-violence, this doesn't mean an absence of protest. In 1989, the Dalai Lama received the Nobel Peace Prize, in which he communicated that everyone is bounded by the same wants and desires. Happiness and the want to be happy is the core of humanity. These are the values that we hold true to ourselves, and where we are guided by these to make our actions. If we remember that happiness and the want to be happy, the Dalai Lama believes that Tibet's cause will prevail. In regards to our research question, the conflict between China and Tibet emphasizes the idea of forgiving but not forgetting. The Dalai Lama asserts that we can forgive the actor, but not necessarily forgive the action. However, my only question is, how can the Tibetan monks forgive China without forgiving the atrocities committed against them? If they cling to these atrocities, that would be clinging to the impermanent.
Okay, so we've thrown a lot at you so far. We've thrown history, we've thrown practice, this guy called the Dalai Lama. So I'm going to try to wrap this up together and make it make a little bit more sense in terms of the concepts we've been discussing in class. So because we're talking about Tibetan Buddhist monks, I think it would be remiss to recognize how compassion and forgiveness are tied to spirituality. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean religion. I'm sure you all know people who are very religious and not very spiritual, and people who are very spiritual and not very religious. Noah Levine, in his book, A Heart of the Revolution, explains that Buddhism actually provides a middle path between straight worldliness and religion, because Buddhism wants to renounce the hypocrisy and the extra things that religion sometimes is tied to outside of the just pure connection between the self and the universe or God or nature. So with that, the center of Buddhism really is compassion. We've talked about that a lot. And because the Buddhists are pacifist and supposed to always be showing compassion and giving compassion to others, it makes this conflict with the Chinese very, very complicated, because they can't wage war back against the Chinese. They can't revolt in any sort of violent way. So they have to find a new way to make their voice heard outside of what we usually think is the right way, with fighting and to try to forcefully take back what is yours. So this is where we see the conflict. The whole tenet of Buddhism is to remove suffering. So they have to fight and wrestle with the concept of the suffering that the Chinese is giving them, and then not producing more suffering on themselves, which is what suicide is. They're lighting themselves on fire and killing themselves very slowly and painfully. So the question is whether it is better for them to give themselves compassion and fight against the Chinese, or if it's worse because they are promoting suffering on themselves. Is this form of protest really, truly compassionate? The Dalai Lama explained that for them to allow the Chinese to keep committing violence against them, to keep oppressing them, that it goes just as much against their Buddhist beliefs as if they were to fight back. So this is the best way that they have figured out how to protest without committing violence against others. They're just keeping it very internalized to themselves. So why does this actually matter? In such a complex and painful world that we live in, I think it's really important to recognize that we can learn from each other, from different beliefs, so that we can not only empathize but learn and grow together. This quote, in a multi-faith and multi-suffering world, being friends cannot be something that's limited by boundaries of faith tradition. This is from a scholar of Buddhist Christian studies, and I think this really applies here, because this self-immolation is not just suicide. It's something that's very slow, it's very painful, and it's very dramatic. It's something that takes some serious commitment. And this is a response to the global silence. News writer Chambers explains that no one around the globe wants to address the issue in Tibet because of the implications it would have on China. You don't want to piss off China because they control trade, they control a lot of things. So the world remains pretty silent about all of these issues going on, and that even stands with America. And we're supposed to be the ones who are going and fighting for justice, but we aren't going to mess with China, so we won't say anything about, we won't say much about the issues in Tibet. So as we were talking, we were having a hard time trying to find what our end goal really was with this case study project. It seemed really ambiguous. We had all these ideas and we didn't really know how to sum it up. So the idea that we kind of want to end with is the idea of empathy, because that's really what the monks are searching for. They are trying to get the world to see their pain, so they need to do something dramatic to make the world pay attention. They're setting themselves on fire to show their inward pain in an outward way. And this is just something that needs to be seen. In our current political situation in America, there's a complete and total lack of empathy. One side cannot see from the other side, and so there's no discussion, and there's all these intellectual walls built up. And we have these violent protests that happen, and it's only when we see this violence and we see someone die or be hurt that we start to have empathy for them.
So we actually, as Kristen said, we didn't really know what the end goal of our case study was. There were so many answers, which was part of the point, but we wanted to have something for you guys to take home. So we actually interviewed Dr. Lyons, who's a professor here of religious studies, and he teaches a course about Buddhism, learning about it through Star Wars and the dogma there, which is really interesting. And he's what made us think of empathy. We were talking to him and he said it, and all of a sudden it hit home and made sense. So we actually have a clip from our interview for you guys to listen to. There's a little bit of background noise, but if you listen, you get the main message.
Putting yourself on, the biggest one is empathy. One of the biggest problems we have, I think, is a lack of empathy. And what the monks are trying to show us about this job, putting yourself on fire, this is what I feel like. This is what this does for me, to me. And that's why I haven't looked at the history of it. I did a little bit of the history of it, but that's what I think of. And I think it's lack of empathy. I think we lack so much of that. And so what the monks do, to some extent, I think, is to point to the lack of empathy. You deny me this right when you deny yourself this right. And what they're asking for It's not everything that anyone else does. Would not expect. I think I said it right. I teach Fisher a seminar on Malcolm X, and one of his speeches that he has is by any means necessary. And he has said he's going to fight for to be thought of as a human being, to be treated as a human being at this time on this planet by any means necessary. He wants to be human, treated like a human being by any means necessary. And I think that is what self-regulation recognize and by any means necessary. He's doing, he's doing it.
So we've gone over history, we've gone on all of these different things, but the biggest thing we want you to really take away with is to try your hardest to maintain having empathy for all these other people. Our world is so dark and so bleak sometimes, and we're constantly bombarded with all these negative things and negative happenings, but don't let that stop you from being empathetic and for feeling for other people. Thank you.